Hey YouTubers, it's me, Lonnie Clark, Nuts for Art, Beyond Extinction Love. I'm going to read another portion of this book. We're almost at the end. My apologies for skipping a day without going into it. I just couldn't get it done yesterday, so I didn't. Yikes. So let's get into this. We're on April 7th, page 159. And as you recall, they are packing their bags because an effigy was burned of him after he came back and the world found out what he'd done. Give it up to white supremacists. Those people are serious, aren't they? April 7th. The Star Telegram carried an excellent, accurate story as a follow-up to the effigy hanging. It made things clear. It clarifies motives, and it certainly lifted the entire matter above segregation and desegregation. Yet I learned that they burned a cross just above our house at the Negro school, and that someone remarked that they should have burned it on my land. I wish they had. It would have been far better than burning it at the school. The Turners crowded us into their house. The relief to be there, surrounded by friends, away from hostility and threats of the bullies and castrators, was so great that we were suddenly filled with exhaustion. April 11th. We returned to Mansfield, deciding to hide away no longer. The mail poured in, hearteningly favorable and moving. Most people in other areas, including the Deep South, understood, though the situation remained uncomfortable at home. Our townspeople wanted to keep things peaceful at all costs. They said I had stirred things up. This is laudable, and tragic. I, too, say let us be peaceful. But the only way to do this is to first assure justice. By keeping peaceful in this instance, we end up consenting to the destruction of all peace. So for long as we condone injustice by a small but powerful group, we condone the destruction of all social stability, all real peace, in all trust in man's good intentions towards his fellow man. June 19th, Father's Day. There were 6,000 letters to date and only 9 of them abusive. My favorable letters came from deep South states, from the whites. They confirmed my contention that the average Southern white is more properly disposed than he dares allow his neighbors to see, that he is more afraid of his white racists than he is of the Negro. Justice Bach sent me a copy of his controversial speech at Radcliffe. He put it clearly, quote, I am an old, angry man about racial segregation. I live in a city where 25% of the population is Negro, and I doubt that percentage is much higher except in this spot in the 11 Civil War states. I am angry that I am being told I cannot understand the problem. I do not believe that it takes a genius to pierce the heart of a situation to which Southern chivalry once gave, among other things, the mulatto. The cry about lack of understanding and the need for time to work things out are only excuses to do little or nothing about them. And for almost 100 years, this served the South very well. With all the pious talk against communism, the present conflict over integration is doing the work of the communists almost better than they could do it themselves. This is to our shame, when we should be sharpening and perfecting our procedures. It is only a mixture of ignorance and conceit that leads one section of the country to assume that no human beings on earth but themselves can understand the conditions under which they live. I am annoyed by those who love mankind but are cruel and discourteous to people, unquote. And that comes from Curtis Bach, Justice of the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania, speech at Radcliffe College commencement, 1960. I worked all afternoon and then went home and took a shower. Returning to my office in the evening, the desolation of the little town on a frighteningly hot Sunday struck me. And it struck me, too, that no one there forgets. No one there forgives. I ran the lines of disapproval every time I drove through town to my office at the edge of the woods. This afternoon, the town was deserted except for the loafers who stood around at the filling station and the street corners. All of them eyed me with animosity. Teenage boys in their jeans lounged against building fronts. They stared. One of the town's citizens, who had been cordial to me, drove up and stopped beside me at the red light. I waved. He looked grimly away, not wanting the loungers to see him make a friendly gesture, not wanting them to carry tales. I smelled the sun-softened asphalt, smelled the summer odors of clover, swallowed the rebuff, and drove on. But I found myself looking down the country lane that leads to the barn, checking to make sure that no one's car blocked the path. The lane was clear, but the neighbors were out in their yard. The woman stared hard at her feet. The husband lifted up his head from weeding and glared at me as I drove past. I fixed my gaze on the sandy ruts and looked neither left nor right. I had tried nodding too many times. In my rearview mirror, I saw them after I had passed, saw them standing there like statues, peering after me through the fog of the pink dust raised by my wheels. August 14th. It was late in the afternoon of a sunny, humid day. My parents, unable to bear the hostility, had sold their home and all their furniture and left for Mexico, where they had hoped to find a new life. We, too, were going, since we had decided it was too great an injustice to our children to remain. But I felt I must remain a while longer, until the bullies had a chance to carry out their threats against me. I could not allow them to say they had chased me out. They had promised to fix me on July 15th, and now they said they would do it on August 15th. Across the pastures, the incredible vulgarity of highly amplified hillbilly music drifted from the cafe on the highway. I sat in the barren studio where I had worked so many hours, emptied now of all except the table and the typewriter and the bed, stripped of its sheets, only with the mattress ticking, staring up at the ceiling. Empty bookshelves surrounded me. A few yards away, my parents' house stood equally empty. I wandered back and forth from my barn to the house. Wow. On August 17th, this is August 17th, sorry about that. I stayed on. The lane leading to my barn office remained empty. They did not come for me. I hired a Negro youth to come and help me clean up my parents' house so it would be spotless for the new owners. The youth knew me and had no reticence talking, since he was sure I was one of them, so to speak. Both Negroes and whites have gained certainty from the experiment. Because I was a Negro for 6 weeks, I remained partly Negro or perhaps essentially Negro. While we swept and burned old newspapers, we talked. "Why do the whites hate us? We don't hate them," he asked. We had a long conversation during which he brought out the obvious facts that whites teach their children to call them niggers. He said this happened to him all the time, and that he would not even go into a white neighborhood because it sickened him to be called that. He said revealing things. "Your children don't hate us, do they?" "Oh, God, no," I said. "Children have to be taught that kind of filth. We'd never permit ours to learn it." Dr. Cook's like that. His little girl called me nigger, and he told her if he ever heard her say that again, he'd spank her until she couldn't sit down. The Negro does not understand the white any more than the white understands the Negro. I was dismayed to see the extent to which this youth exaggerated. How could he do otherwise? The feelings of the whites towards Negro. He thought they all hated him. The most distressing repercussion of this lack of communication has been the rise of racism among Negroes, justified to some extent, but a grave symptom nevertheless. It only widens the gap of good men will it only widens the gap the good men will hold on, I'm struggling with this sentence. Sorry about that. It only widens the gap that good men of goodwill are trying desperately to bridge the understanding and with compassion. It only strengthens the white racist cause. The Negro who now turns in a moment of near realization of his liberties and bares his fangs at the man's whiteness makes the same tragic error the white racist has made. And it is happening on a wider scale. Too many of the more militant leaders are preaching Negro superiority. I pray that the Negro will not miss his chance to rise to greatness, to build from strength gained through his past suffering, and above all, to rise beyond vengeance. If some spark does not set the keg afire, it will be a senseless tragedy. If some spark does set the keg afire, it will be a senseless tragedy of ignorant against ignorant, injustice answering injustice, a holocaust that will drag down the innocent and right-thinking masses of human beings. Then we will all pay for not having cried for justice long ago. And we are at the epilogue, folks, which is pretty good. What happened since Black Like Me? The experiment that led to writing Black Like Me was done at the very end of 1959, before the first freedom rides or any other manifestation of national concern about racial injustice. It was undertaken to discover if America was involved in the practice of racism against Black Americans. Most white Americans denied any taint of racism and really believed that in this land we judged every man by his qualities as a human individual. In those days, any mention of racism brought to the public's mind the Nazi suppression of the Jewish people, of concentration camps, the gas chambers, and certainly we protested. We were not like that. If we could not accept our somewhat different practice of racist suppression of the Black Americans, how could we ever hope to correct it? Our experience with the Nazis had shown one thing. Where racism is practiced, it damages the whole community, not just the victim group. Were we racist or not? That was the important thing to discover. Black men told me that the only way a white man could hope to understand anything about his reality was to wake up some morning in a black man's skin. I decided to try this in order to test this one thing. In order to take the test, I would alter my pigment and shave my head, but change nothing else about myself. I would keep my clothing, my speech patterns, my credentials, and I would answer every question truthfully. Therefore, if we did, as we claimed, judge each man by his quality of a human individual, my life as Black John Howard Griffin would not be greatly changed, since I was the same human individual, altered only in appearance. If, on the other hand, we looked at men, saw the pigment of skin, applied all the false racial and ethnic characteristics, then, since I bore that mark, my life would be changed in ways I could not anticipate. I learned within a very few hours that no one was judging me by my qualities as a human individual, and that everyone was judging me by my pigment. As soon as white men or women saw me, they automatically assumed I possessed a whole set of false characteristics. False not only to me, but to all black men. They could not see me or any other black man as a human individual because they buried us under a garbage of their stereotyped view of us. They saw us as different from themselves in fundamental ways. We were irresponsible. We were different in our sexual morals. We were intellectually limited. We had a God-given sense of rhythm. We were lazy and happy-go-lucky. We loved watermelon and fried chicken. How could white men ever really know black men if on every contact the white man's stereotyped view of the black man got in the way? I never knew a black man who felt this stereotype fit him. Always, in every encounter, even the good whites, we had the feeling that the white person was not talking with us, but with his image of us. But white man would protest, they really are like that. I've known hundreds of them, and they are always the same. My white men would claim black men were really happy. They liked it that way. And in a sense, such white men had good evidence for these claims, because if black men did not, in those days, play the stereotyped role of the good Negro, if he did not do his yesing and grinning and act out a stereotyped image, he was immediately considered a bad Negro, called uppity, smart-alecky, arrogant, and he could lose his job, be attacked, and driven away. White society had sewn everything up. If you didn't grin and yes, you were in deep trouble. If you did, then you allowed white America to go right on believing in the stereotype. People like Martin Luther King, they said, were just troublemakers and subversives. Whites told their black employees, and really believed it, that the NAACP and Martin Luther King were the black man's greatest enemies. They were offended by any suggestion of injustice. They claimed they had always treated black people wonderfully well and always would so long as black people stayed in their place. If you asked them what that place was, they could not really say, but every black man knew that the place was right in the middle of the stereotype. Often they would face the black employee with this direct question. Aren't you happy with your situation? Don't I treat you good? If the black man had any hopes of remaining employed, he had to plaster that smile all over his face and agree. Once when I was employed at some menial job, I noticed that one of the white middle-aged bosses kept looking at me and getting more and more irritated. I could not imagine what I was doing wrong. Certainly I was sad, and that sadness must have shown, for finally he yelled at me, "What's eating at you anyways?" "Nothing," I said. "Well, why are you so sullen about?" He said. "Oh, nothing," I repeated. "Well, if you want to hang on to this job, you better show us some teeth." And I did my grinning. In those days, the deepest despair hung over the lives of black people, a sense of utter hopelessness, for it seemed that no one in this country knew, or if they knew, couldn't care less about the hopeless situation. Good whites, not the type that is overtly bigoted, urged us to work, study, lift ourselves up by our bootstraps. They really thought that was the remedy. They did not realize that every time black men thought they had found a loophole in the closed society, a way to accomplish this, that loophole was quickly plugged by the consent of all white society. For example, we did not see whites-only signs on the doors of the libraries where we could find learning and books, but we knew we had better not try to enter one. We saw no white-only signs on the doors of schools or of universities, but we knew it was suicidal to try to enter one. Above all, that good advice sounded hollow to us because we knew that when men, even educated men, judged you by your pigment, it didn't matter how much you had worked, studied, or lifted yourself up. The PhD had to walk just as far to get food, water, and restroom facilities as the illiterate. and he could be turned away with the same base discourtesy. So the predominant feeling was one of hopelessness and despair. That white man is not going to let you have anything, black people would say. I'm going to stop here. I see we're at 20 minutes. We really are almost done with this, you guys. We only have a few pages left, probably 2 more readings. We're at page 168, midway through the page. And I will pick this up. I'm hoping I can pick this up again tomorrow. I have a very busy day. It's Saturday. It's my daughter's, I can't believe it, it's her 44th birthday. So I have a busy day. But I'm hoping that I can squeeze in a reading and on Saturday. I appreciate those of you who have been listening and have appreciated me reading this story. It's very kind of you. You make very kind remarks. The few of you that actually are listening. My analytics tell me that not very many people are actually listening. And that most stop listening, I think it was after 3 minutes max. So I don't know who's, or maybe that only counts. You can stop, start. But anyways, I do appreciate it. And I do want to leave you with this, that happiness is resistance. I know we're living in trying times, and there is more of us than them. And I don't believe that evil can prevail. It might have a handle on things right now, but I think that overall humanity is moving in a better direction if we don't allow people to destroy it all. But anyways, put your courage feet on, you guys, and we'll talk to you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.